The sound that woke me up that morning was the exact kind of sound every engineer learns to fear. I remember my eyes snapping open at exactly 5:12 in the morning as a violent metallic grinding noise ripped through the silence outside my bedroom window, so sharp and unnatural that for half a second I thought part of the reservoir structure had already failed on its own. The cabin walls were vibrating. I sat upright instantly, heart pounding hard against my chest while the deep mechanical rumble continued somewhere beyond the eastern side of the property where the lake sat hidden behind a line of pine trees. Beside me, the digital clock glowed red against the darkness while cold mountain air pushed through the cracked bedroom window carrying something that made my stomach tighten immediately. Diesel fuel. Freshly disturbed wet soil. Hydraulic oil. I threw the blanket aside, pulled on yesterday's jeans without even bothering with shoes, and ran barefoot down the hardwood hallway toward the front entrance while the grinding noise outside grew louder with every second. The second I opened the front door, freezing Colorado air slammed into my face so hard it knocked the warmth right out of my lungs. The sky was still dark blue with only the faintest strip of pale morning light beginning to form above the ridgeline, but I could already see industrial floodlights cutting across the lake shoreline nearly 300 feet from the house. My boots sat beside the porch steps and I jammed them on while staring toward the reservoir basin in disbelief. Two full-sized yellow excavators were already positioned directly against the western retaining wall of my private dam, hydraulic arms moving in violent controlled bursts as steel buckets tore through reinforced concrete I had personally designed and built 14 years earlier. Every impact sent low vibrations through the frozen ground beneath my feet. I could hear concrete cracking under pressure. I could hear pressurized water shifting behind the containment wall with a sound no normal person would notice but one I recognized immediately. Internal pressure imbalance. My pulse accelerated instantly. Then I saw her. Standing calmly 20 yards from the excavation crew wearing a cream winter coat that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment stood Rebecca Whitmore, president of Pine Ridge Summit HOA. Blonde hair perfectly arranged despite the freezing wind rolling off the reservoir. Her arms were folded. She was smiling. The same smug expression she always wore every time she sent another notice demanding I pay association fees for a community I was never legally part of. I started running downhill toward the shoreline, gravel sliding violently under my boots while the cold air burned inside my chest. "Stop the machine right now!" I shouted as loud as I could. One of the operators looked toward me but kept working. Rebecca turned slowly, almost amused seeing me finally arrive. "Good morning, Daniel," she called casually over the sound of hydraulic pistons grinding against concrete. "I figured if you refused to cooperate with the community had every right to remove unauthorized structures affecting neighborhood compliance." I stopped dead about 15 feet from the first excavator and stared past her toward the dam wall where fresh cracks had already begun spreading across the lower pressure barrier. The workers had no idea what they were touching. Rebecca had no idea what she had just started. But standing there with diesel fumes mixing with freezing lake air while the first low vibration rolled through the water beneath the retaining wall, one terrifying thought hit me harder than the sound of concrete breaking. They were not tearing down a dam. They were dismantling the only thing keeping their entire neighborhood alive. I could feel the frozen gravel grinding beneath my boots as I stood staring at the excavator bucket tearing through reinforced concrete that had taken me nearly 11 months to design and build, and standing there in that bitter Colorado mountain wind, I could not stop thinking about my father because none of this property was ever supposed to become part of some luxury community surrounded by entitled people who thought money automatically gave them ownership over everything they could see. My name is Daniel Mercer. I am 42 years old, and most people who meet me for the first time make the exact same mistake. They assume because I live alone on 60 acres overlooking a private mountain reservoir and drive a black Land Rover that I must be another wealthy investor who bought vacation property for scenery and tax advantages. What they do not understand is I built every inch of what stood behind me with my own hands and 15 years of engineering experience most people around Pine Ridge Summit never even knew existed. I spent 12 years working civil infrastructure projects across the western United States, specializing in water retention systems, municipal drainage planning, and flood mitigation design for mountain communities exactly like the one now sitting less than half a mile downhill from my reservoir basin. I knew how water moved through rock layers. I understood pressure loads better than most structural engineers I had ever worked beside. But more important than all of that, I understood this specific land better than anyone alive because my father had purchased the original acreage back in 1997 after spending 26 years running excavation contracts throughout Colorado. Growing up, I spent summers operating bulldozers before I was legally old enough to drive on public roads. I learned to read topographic survey maps before most kids learned basic algebra. My father used to say mountain water never forgives arrogance because gravity does not negotiate with people who ignore engineering. That lesson stayed with me long after he passed 7 years ago. When developers started building Pine Ridge Summit 3 years later, county engineers approached me privately asking if I would consider designing a runoff retention structure to help stabilize seasonal water pressure during heavy snowmelt months. The natural slope behind my property sat directly above the entire subdivision basin. Without additional runoff absorption, heavy spring melt would push dangerous pressure directly toward the lower residential district. So I designed the dam myself. 32 feet wide. Reinforced concrete retention wall anchored into granite bedrock. 12,000-gallon overflow capacity routed through underground spillway channels feeding directly into county drainage pipes connected beneath Pine Ridge Summit. I paid for everything personally because protecting this land meant more to me than profit. Rebecca Whitmore knew none of that when she started demanding HOA fees 6 months earlier. To her, I was simply another homeowner refusing to follow rules. But standing there now in freezing dawn air while hydraulic steel ripped through the exact structure quietly protecting every luxury home below my elevation line, I felt something colder than panic settling into my chest because unlike Rebecca, I understood exactly what happens when people start dismantling infrastructure they do not understand. And judging by the fresh fracture line already spreading through the lower pressure chamber, I knew the first irreversible mistake had already been made. Rebecca Whitmore had always been the kind of woman who confused administrative authority with actual power, and unfortunately Pine Ridge Summit had spent the last 7 years rewarding that delusion so thoroughly that by the time this morning arrived, she genuinely believed the entire mountain community existed because she allowed it to function. I first met her 8 months earlier during what should have been a routine county planning meeting regarding utility easement maintenance near the lower residential sector. Even then, before she ever spoke directly to me, I noticed the same thing everyone eventually noticed about Rebecca. She carried herself like someone who believed expensive clothing automatically translated into competence. Perfect blonde hair, polished designer boots probably imported from somewhere unnecessarily expensive, oversized sunglasses resting on top of her head even indoors, and that permanent half-smile people develop when they spend too many years giving orders to neighbors who never push back. Rebecca was 52 years old, president of Pine Ridge Summit Homeowners Association for almost 7 years, and had slowly transformed what started as a quiet luxury mountain development into her own private kingdom built entirely around regulations, fines, and manufactured authority. Residents were fined for outdoor furniture colors. Families received violation notices for parking oversized pickup trucks in visible driveways overnight. She once threatened legal action against a retired veteran because his boat trailer disrupted community aesthetic standards during a holiday weekend. Every conversation with Rebecca eventually turned into some variation of the same principle. She believed control existed for the sole purpose of being exercised. The problem started 6 months earlier when she began sending me monthly invoices demanding I contribute nearly $1,800 annually toward HOA maintenance fees. The first notice arrived by certified mail on a Thursday afternoon while I was replacing pressure sensors near the spillway monitoring station below the reservoir. I remember laughing out loud standing there with grease on my gloves because my property legally sat entirely outside Pine Ridge Summit boundaries. The subdivision ended 400 yards downhill from my western property marker. I ignored the letter. 2 weeks later a second notice arrived. Then a third. Then legal warnings started appearing. Rebecca somehow convinced herself proximity meant jurisdiction. Apparently because my reservoir visually overlooked her precious neighborhood, she believed I automatically became financially obligated to support community landscaping budgets, clubhouse maintenance, private security patrols, and seasonal decorative lighting expenses I had never once used in my life. The final confrontation happened 11 days earlier when she personally drove up in her white Lexus SUV and stepped onto my property carrying a leather folder stuffed with compliance documents. I still remember the sharp smell of expensive perfume mixing with pine trees while she stood there staring at me like a disappointed school principal. Every responsible property owner contributes to the community around them, Daniel, she said coldly. I looked directly at her and gave the same answer I had repeated for months. Your community begins 400 yards below my property line. I do not live in your neighborhood. Something changed behind her eyes that afternoon. The fake politeness disappeared completely. She folded the documents shut and smiled in a way that instantly told me logic had officially left the conversation. Then perhaps you need a reminder, she said quietly before walking back toward her Lexus. Standing here now in freezing dawn air watching excavator steel tear directly into infrastructure protecting the exact homes she spent years pretending to serve, I finally understood what that sentence really meant. Rebecca Whitmore had never wanted my money. She wanted obedience. And this morning, she had decided punishment mattered more than understanding consequences. I could hear the excavator hydraulics groaning louder now as another section of reinforced concrete began splitting apart under pressure, and standing there less than 20 feet from the reservoir wall, I immediately noticed something that nobody else around me had the training to recognize. The water level was shifting too fast. At first glance it looked subtle, almost invisible if you were not actively watching for pressure imbalance, but years of engineering work had trained my eyes to catch structural changes the same way a pilot notices turbulence before passengers feel the aircraft move. The surface of the reservoir had begun vibrating in irregular wave patterns moving diagonally instead of naturally dispersing outward. That meant internal pressure was redistributing unevenly behind the containment wall. My pulse accelerated instantly. I stepped closer toward the excavation crew and shouted again, this time louder. Shut the machine down now. The nearest operator hesitated briefly and looked toward Rebecca instead of me, which told me everything I needed to know about who had been giving instructions all morning. Rebecca did not even glance at the dam. She kept her arms folded against the freezing mountain air while staring at me with the same satisfied expression people wear when they think humiliation has become irreversible. You really should have thought about cooperating earlier, Daniel, she said casually over the grinding steel noise. I ignored her completely and crouched near the lower runoff channel where thin streams of displaced water had already begun leaking through stress fractures spreading across the western retention seam. My stomach tightened immediately. That was impossible unless the pressure chamber behind the primary wall had already started losing equilibrium. I ran my hand against the cold concrete surface and could actually feel low vibration pulses traveling through the structure every few seconds. The entire dam was reacting. I stood immediately and pointed directly at the operator. You are cutting into a live retention load without releasing basin pressure first. The man killed the engine for half a second and leaned partially out of the cab. Lady told us county authorized full removal. Rebecca stepped forward before I could answer. Temporary environmental compliance order, she interrupted sharply. This structure was never properly approved. I almost laughed hearing that because she clearly had no idea what kind of paperwork existed behind this reservoir. But right now paperwork was no longer my biggest concern. I looked past the excavator toward the lower valley where Pine Ridge Summit stretched quietly beneath morning fog less than half a mile downhill. Hundreds of luxury homes sat directly inside a drainage network specifically engineered around overflow pressure absorbed by the exact structure now being dismantled in front of me. Another loud crack suddenly echoed across the reservoir basin and I turned instantly. A new fracture line had appeared running vertically down the lower spillway chamber. Too fast. Much too fast. The ground beneath my boots gave a slight vibration strong enough that I physically felt it in my knees. That should not have been happening yet. Rebecca noticed my expression shift and smiled wider, mistaking concern for defeat. "Looks like this little argument is finally over," she said quietly. I stared directly at her for several long seconds while cold mountain wind carried the sharp smell of wet soil rising from the newly exposed foundation trench. She thought she was winning some petty financial dispute over association fees. But standing there listening to water pressure moving violently behind fractured concrete, I realized something terrifying. They had already pushed the system past the point where simple repairs could reverse what was happening. And for the very first time that morning, I stopped worrying about losing the dam. I started worrying about what was about to happen to everything sitting downhill. The second I felt that vibration travel through the concrete wall beneath my hand, instinct took over faster than conscious thought, and I immediately pulled my phone from my pocket while stepping backward away from the reservoir edge, my eyes locked on the fracture line spreading wider along the lower spillway chamber with every passing second. I dialed County Infrastructure Services first because at this point legal arguments had become meaningless. This had escalated beyond permits and paperwork. The line connected after 2 rings and I began speaking before the operator even finished greeting me. "My name is Daniel Mercer and I need immediate transfer to County Emergency Engineering Review. Active water retention structure failure risk, Pine Ridge Summit Upper Basin Sector." I could still hear the excavator idling behind me while Rebecca watched impatiently, clearly annoyed I was still refusing to surrender quietly. After 12 seconds the operator transferred me to another line where a man answered sounding half awake. I repeated everything quickly, explaining unauthorized structural demolition had begun against an active private retention system directly connected to county runoff infrastructure servicing Pine Ridge Summit Residential District. Silence. Then the man finally responded. "Sir, according to records we have temporary environmental removal authorization already filed for that structure." I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth hurt. Of course Rebecca had already poisoned the paperwork. "Listen carefully," I said sharply. "I designed this retention system personally. The lower subdivision stormwater channels were engineered around my overflow basin 15 years ago. If they continue removing pressure support without controlled release procedures, downstream infrastructure may destabilize." The man hesitated. I could practically hear him reading documents instead of listening to me. "Sir, if county-approved temporary demolition permits there is likely no immediate compliance concern." I stared toward the reservoir surface where water movement had become visibly unstable now. Small rotational currents forming near the eastern containment edge where there should have been perfectly still water. They had already compromised internal balance. I ended the call without another word and immediately dialed the excavation company listed on the contractor truck parked 20 yards uphill. Maybe someone on site would understand engineering language better than bureaucrats reading permit codes. A dispatcher answered after 3 rings. I gave the site number visible on the truck door and demanded immediate contact with the project supervisor. Within seconds a man picked up sounding irritated. I identified myself and spoke as clearly as possible. "Your operators are removing a live reinforced retention structure without staged hydraulic pressure release. You need to stop immediately." I heard him pause. "We have county clearance and environmental authorization, sir." Same answer. Different voice. I looked toward Rebecca standing beside the excavator now smiling openly, almost enjoying the spectacle of me scrambling unsuccessfully against a machine she believed was already protected by official paperwork. She raised one hand and gave me a tiny mocking wave like this entire situation was some personal victory celebration. I slowly lowered the phone and stared at her for several long seconds while freezing wind rolled down off the mountain carrying the sharp mineral smell rising from disturbed wet earth near the fractured foundation line. Another deep cracking sound echoed behind me and I turned instinctively. The fracture had widened another 3 inches. Water pressure was escalating faster than predicted. I realized then that nobody was coming to stop this. County officials were trusting false paperwork. Contractors were following authorized permits. Rebecca believed bureaucracy had made her untouchable. But standing there watching the reservoir physically react in ways only I fully understood, something inside me changed completely because I finally accepted the truth. I had warned every single person who mattered. and now the disaster moving beneath that water was no longer my responsibility. I stood there for nearly 10 full seconds with my phone hanging loosely in my hand while the morning wind rolled across the reservoir carrying the cold smell of pine trees, diesel exhaust, and freshly broken concrete dust rising from the widening foundation trench where the excavators had already stripped away almost a third of the western retaining wall. Somewhere behind me I could still hear Rebecca talking casually with one of the contractors, her voice calm and satisfied like this was nothing more than a routine landscaping project instead of a rapidly destabilizing hydraulic system beginning to move beyond safe structural limits. The worst part was knowing exactly what came next. Most people think dams fail dramatically all at once, like some instant collapse straight out of an action movie, but real infrastructure failure almost never works that way. Systems warn you first. Tiny signs. Pressure shifts. Stress redistribution. Microscopic fracture propagation invisible to untrained eyes. I had spent over 15 years learning how to recognize those warnings, and standing here now I could already feel the sequence unfolding exactly the way I feared. I turned away from Rebecca completely and started walking uphill toward the equipment shed near the back of my property because suddenly I remembered something I had not looked at in years. My original reservoir engineering archive. The steel door creaked sharply when I pulled it open and stale cold air rushed outward carrying the familiar smell of motor oil, old blueprints, rusted metal shelving, and dust that had settled undisturbed for months. I moved quickly toward the rear workbench where dozens of old engineering binders sat stacked beside survey instruments my father left me years earlier. My hands were moving faster now, adrenaline making every breath feel shallow as I pulled open the faded black binder labeled Mercer Reservoir Development Phase 2 Final County Submission. I dropped the binder onto the workbench and immediately began flipping through oversized folded diagrams until I found exactly what I had been searching for. Original hydraulic integration schematics filed 15 years earlier with County Infrastructure Development Review. The second I spread the blueprint flat under the overhead work light, my stomach tightened harder than anything I had felt that morning. There in thick blue engineering notation running directly beneath Pine Ridge Summit Lower Residential District sat the exact detail I suddenly realized Rebecca never would have checked before authorizing demolition. The subdivision stormwater system was never built independently. During original development negotiations, county planners rejected a full municipal runoff system because excavation costs exceeded budget projections. Instead, engineers rerouted all overflow pressure channels directly toward my reservoir retention basin where excess seasonal runoff would be absorbed automatically before pressure ever reached residential infrastructure downhill. I stared at the blueprint for several silent seconds listening faintly to the distant grinding sound of excavator steel still tearing apart the dam outside while cold realization settled heavier with every line I read. The entire neighborhood had never been protected by county drainage infrastructure. It had been protected by me. I traced the schematic further down until reaching the final pressure management annotation buried near the lower corner of the page. If primary reservoir retention structure becomes compromised, downstream runoff channels exceed safe operating threshold within 12 to 18 hours during moderate precipitation event. I stopped breathing for a second. 12 to 18 hours. Then I remembered the weather report I had heard on the radio the night before. Heavy mountain rainfall expected by evening. Outside somewhere beyond the shed walls, another deep crack echoed across the reservoir basin louder than any before it. And in that exact moment I understood with absolute certainty that Rebecca Whitmore had not just destroyed my dam. She had unknowingly started a countdown that was already moving towards something none of them were remotely prepared to survive. For nearly a full minute I stood frozen inside the equipment shed with that oversized engineering blueprint spread across the steel workbench while cold morning air drifted through the partially open door carrying the distant mechanical roar of excavators still working outside, and the more I stared at those pressure management schematics, the more I realized this situation had already moved far beyond anything Rebecca Whitmore could possibly understand. She thought this was a dispute over neighborhood fees. She thought tearing apart my reservoir system was some clever act of administrative punishment. What she had actually done was disconnect the single hydraulic buffer protecting every home sitting downhill from seasonal mountain runoff that this entire region experienced every spring and late summer storm cycle. I grabbed the blueprint and ran back outside toward the shoreline where the reservoir now looked noticeably different than it had even 15 minutes earlier. The surface water was no longer stable. Circular rotational currents had begun forming near the eastern spillway edge where pressure redistribution was already forcing water against sections of the basin never designed to absorb direct load transfer. I could hear it now too. A low unnatural groaning sound rising beneath the water itself, deep and rhythmic, almost like the entire structure was breathing under stress. The excavators had stopped temporarily while workers repositioned steel tracks near the damaged western wall, and Rebecca stood nearby scrolling casually through her phone like she had already mentally moved on from the destruction she ordered. I walked directly toward her, blueprint rolled tightly in my fist. "You need to stop this immediately," I said sharply. She barely looked up. "I thought we already had this conversation." I stepped closer and pointed directly toward the reservoir. "Your subdivision drainage system was engineered around this retention basin. Every runoff channel below Pine Ridge Summit routes excess stormwater pressure directly here. Without this dam absorbing overflow capacity, the entire lower residential district loses hydraulic protection." For the first time all morning, I saw confusion flicker briefly across her face. Not understanding. Just irritation. The kind people feel when someone keeps interrupting a victory they already believe they earned. She folded her phone shut and sighed dramatically. "Daniel, I do not know what technical fantasy you keep inventing, but County Environmental Review already approved demolition." I stared at her for several seconds and realized something deeply unsettling. She genuinely believed paperwork was stronger than physics. I unrolled the blueprint halfway and shoved it toward her. "Look at the county submission stamp. 15 years old. These are original infrastructure integration schematics. Your neighborhood was built around this system." She glanced at the documents for less than 2 seconds before pushing them away with visible annoyance. "I am not interested in excuses." Behind us, one of the operators restarted the nearest excavator and the hydraulic engine roared violently back to life. The steel bucket lifted slowly before crashing directly into another section of damaged retaining wall. A deep cracking boom echoed instantly across the basin and I physically felt vibration pulse upward through the soles of my boots. This time several workers looked around uneasily. Even they heard the structural response. I turned instinctively toward the mountain ridge to the west and my stomach dropped immediately. Thick dark storm clouds were already beginning to gather above the tree line far earlier than forecasted, heavy and dense against the morning sky. Cold wind shifted direction sharply and the smell changed instantly. Rain. Fast-moving mountain rain. I looked back toward Rebecca standing stubbornly beside the machine she refused to stop, and in that exact second I understood something terrifying. We were no longer racing against engineering failure in 12 hours. Nature had just decided to move the schedule forward. The moment I saw those storm clouds gathering above the western ridge line, every calculation running through my head changed instantly because mountain weather in Colorado does not follow polite schedules, and after spending most of my adult life engineering runoff systems across this region, I knew exactly how dangerous fast-moving elevation storms could become when unstable water infrastructure was already compromised. The air itself had shifted. Only minutes earlier the cold morning wind carried the familiar sharp scent of pine sap and diesel fumes drifting from the excavators, but now a heavier smell was pushing down from higher elevation: wet stone, fresh rain, ozone building in the atmosphere before pressure systems break. I had smelled it hundreds of times before construction inspections in the Rockies, and every instinct I had was screaming the same warning. We were running out of time much faster than the blueprint predicted. I turned away from Rebecca without saying another word because at this point convincing her had become completely pointless. People like Rebecca Whitmore do not listen when evidence challenges authority they already believe they control. I jogged uphill toward the cabin, gravel kicking behind my boots while the first low rumble of thunder rolled faintly somewhere beyond the ridge. Inside the kitchen I grabbed my laptop from the counter and immediately opened the archived county engineering database I still maintained locally from old consulting projects. My fingers moved faster now, adrenaline making every click feel heavier than normal as I pulled up the original Pine Ridge Summit infrastructure submission package filed during subdivision development 14 years earlier. The second the drainage maps loaded, my chest tightened harder than before because I finally found the one detail I had been searching for. The lower residential district had never been given independent storm overflow redundancy. County planners approved a budget reduction clause during final development review that eliminated secondary runoff diversion channels entirely. Instead, overflow pressure during major rainfall events would automatically route through 3 underground concrete culverts directly feeding into my reservoir basin where excess hydraulic load would disperse safely through the retention system I built years later. I zoomed further into the lower elevation sector and stared at the contour lines surrounding the lakefront homes inside Pine Ridge Summit. 47 luxury properties sat directly inside the primary runoff path. 47 homes depending on a system Rebecca had just ordered dismantled because she wanted $1,800 in HOA fees I legally never owed. Outside, another loud metallic crash echoed across the property, followed immediately by a sound that made my stomach twist instantly. Water movement. Not normal reservoir movement either. Fast displacement. I rushed back onto the front porch just as cold wind slammed across the hillside hard enough to shake the pine branches overhead. The nearest excavator had punched through another support section, and now I could visibly see water beginning to force itself through newly exposed fractures near the western retaining seam in thin unstable streams. Too early. The pressure redistribution had accelerated faster than projected. Then the first raindrop hit the wooden porch railing. Heavy. Cold. Less than 3 seconds later another followed. Then another. I looked toward the subdivision below where expensive mountain homes sat peacefully beneath darkening skies, completely unaware that the entire drainage network protecting them had already begun failing in real time. Somewhere near the reservoir edge, Rebecca was still standing beside her contractors, believing this morning had ended with her proving a point about authority. But watching rain begin to fall across the mountain valley while unstable water pressure surged violently behind a broken structure no longer capable of absorbing incoming runoff, I finally understood with perfect clarity that nature had officially entered the conversation. And unlike Rebecca Whitmore, nature does not care who thinks they are in charge. By early afternoon I had stopped trying to intervene entirely because every system involved had already chosen its side, and there comes a point in engineering where continuing to fight human stupidity becomes less useful than simply observing the chain reaction already set in motion. The rain had strengthened far faster than any weather report predicted. Thick gray clouds now completely swallowed the mountain ridge above Pine Ridge Summit, while cold sheets of steady rainfall hammered against the reservoir surface hard enough to erase the smaller pressure ripples I had been tracking all morning. From the covered front porch I stood watching water levels climb in real time while the damaged western retaining wall continued bleeding pressure through widening fractures where the excavators had stopped working nearly an hour earlier. Even the contractors finally sensed something was wrong. Their machines sat silent near the shoreline while workers huddled beside the trucks under rain jackets watching unstable water movement with the kind of nervous silence people develop when instinct begins noticing danger long before understanding catches up. Rebecca, however, remained exactly the same. I could see her standing beneath a large black umbrella near the equipment convoy, talking animatedly on her phone, probably updating the HOA board about another successful enforcement action against the stubborn property owner who refused to follow community rules. The absurdity would have been funny if I did not know exactly what was coming next. I stepped back inside and reopened the live weather radar feed on my laptop. My chest tightened instantly. The storm cell moving over the ridge was far larger than I expected. A dense late summer pressure system stretching nearly 40 miles west, carrying projected rainfall accumulation high enough to push runoff volume past seasonal averages by nearly 30%. Under normal conditions my reservoir would have absorbed every gallon safely without issue. Under current conditions there was no longer a functioning hydraulic buffer protecting the drainage network below. I stared at the map for several silent seconds before hearing a sound outside that immediately pulled me back toward the window. A deep hollow boom unlike anything earlier that morning. Not concrete this time. Structural cavity release. I stepped outside again and instantly spotted the difference. Water was now forcing itself through the lower western foundation seam in 3 separate streams instead of 1, each shooting outward harder than before as internal pressure continued redistributing through damaged containment zones. The reservoir itself had risen nearly 6 inches in less than 40 minutes. Too fast. Much too fast. I looked downhill toward Pine Ridge Summit where luxury mountain homes still sat peacefully around the artificial lake district below. Expensive decks overlooking scenery. Residents paid millions to enjoy, completely unaware their drainage infrastructure had already begun moving toward overload. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten even harder. The first lower storm culvert had activated. I could see dark runoff water beginning to surge through the concrete outflow channel near the northern slope feeding directly towards subdivision retention pipes. That should not have happened for another 2 hours minimum. I checked the reservoir pressure gauge mounted near the porch railing and immediately understood why. The damaged retaining wall had reduced basin absorption capacity by nearly 50%. Incoming stormwater now had nowhere left to stabilize. Downhill infrastructure would begin receiving excess pressure far sooner than any county engineer could possibly react. Another thunderclap rolled across the mountains overhead, louder now, followed by rain intensifying hard enough to blur the valley below into shifting gray haze. Somewhere beneath that storm, Rebecca Whitmore was still standing beside contractors she ordered onto private property, believing she had spent the day proving authority matters more than resistance. Watching runoff channels begin filling faster than engineered safety thresholds allowed, I realized something cold and absolute settling inside me. I was officially done warning people. Now all that remained was waiting for physics to finish explaining what arrogance refused to understand. By 4:30 in the afternoon the storm had fully taken control of the mountain valley, and standing beneath the covered porch watching the entire reservoir system strain under conditions I knew were becoming unsustainable, I could feel that familiar heaviness settling in my chest that every engineer eventually learns to recognize when a preventable failure has crossed the point where human intervention no longer matters. Rain hammered the roof above me so hard the entire cabin vibrated in short rhythmic pulses, while cold runoff water rushed violently through the hillside drainage channels surrounding the property, carving fast-moving streams through gravel pathways that had been completely dry only hours earlier. The reservoir had risen another 11 inches since midday. I checked the pressure gauge mounted near the porch support beam for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, and the reading immediately confirmed what I already suspected. The western retaining section had lost too much structural resistance. The damaged wall was no longer functioning as a pressure regulator. Incoming water volume was now bypassing normal absorption zones entirely and redirecting directly toward the lower municipal drainage system feeding Pine Ridge Summit. I stepped forward toward the edge of the porch and looked downhill through heavy rain where the subdivision sat partially hidden beneath gray sheets of water cascading down the mountain slope. Then I saw it. The first sign. Near the northern perimeter road just beyond the upper lakefront district, one of the primary drainage culverts had begun ejecting water far harder than designed output tolerance. Even from this distance I could see white turbulence spraying against the concrete outflow basin below the retaining channel. That meant downstream pressure had already exceeded engineered safety capacity. Too soon. At least 90 minutes sooner than my original projection. I grabbed my binoculars sitting near the workbench by the door and focused deeper toward the neighborhood streets. Several residents had stepped outside now despite the rain. I could see people standing near driveways staring toward water moving unusually fast along curbside runoff channels that under normal conditions barely carried more than light storm drainage. Something else caught my attention immediately. Rebecca's white Lexus sat parked outside the Pine Ridge Summit clubhouse, and even through the rain distortion I could make out several HOA board members gathering under the covered entrance, all looking downhill toward the expanding runoff flow now moving far faster than any of them expected. I wondered if someone had finally started noticing the pressure buildup. I wondered if Rebecca was beginning to realize that tearing apart infrastructure without understanding what it controls is not leadership. It is recklessness disguised as authority. Then the sound came. Deep. Hollow. Violent enough that I physically felt it through the porch floorboards beneath my boots before my ears fully processed it. I turned instantly toward the reservoir behind me and my stomach dropped. A massive new fracture had opened across the western containment section where the excavators had removed the final reinforcement supports earlier that morning. Water was now forcing outward through the break in thick surging streams instead of narrow pressure leaks, each pulse carrying more volume than the damaged structure could possibly sustain. The entire basin had officially lost hydraulic equilibrium. I looked downhill again just in time to see the first lower neighborhood street begin disappearing beneath fast-moving storm runoff spilling over concrete drainage channels that had already reached full capacity. Cars were stopping. Porch lights were switching on across dozens of homes. Movement everywhere now. Panic had finally entered Pine Ridge Summit. Another thunderclap cracked directly overhead while rain intensified so violently it blurred the valley into chaos beneath shifting gray shadows. Standing there with freezing water mist blowing against my face and the reservoir behind me beginning its final structural failure sequence, I quietly exhaled because after 12 straight hours of warnings nobody wanted to hear, the lesson Rebecca Whitmore refused to learn was finally arriving exactly the only way nature ever teaches arrogance. Through consequences. The exact moment everything finally crossed the point of no return happened at 4:57 in the afternoon, and I remember the time so clearly because I had just lowered the binoculars from my eyes after watching water begin spreading across the first residential roadway inside Pine Ridge Summit when a sound erupted behind me so violent and unnatural that for half a second I thought lightning had struck somewhere directly against the reservoir wall. The entire ground beneath the porch shifted hard enough that the coffee mug sitting on the outdoor railing tipped over instantly and shattered against the wooden deck. I turned so fast I nearly lost balance on the rain-soaked boards, and the second I saw the western containment section my stomach dropped despite already knowing this moment was inevitable. The fractured retaining wall had finally failed under full hydraulic load. Not a dramatic explosion like people imagine when structures break, but something far worse because I understood exactly what I was watching. The entire damaged section had begun separating outward in massive uneven segments, allowing uncontrolled water displacement to force through the compromised structure faster than any remaining concrete reinforcement could contain. Thick walls of dark reservoir water surged violently through the fractured opening carrying mud, debris, broken concrete fragments, and pressure loads now moving exactly where 15 years of engineering had specifically been designed to prevent them from ever reaching. I ran instinctively toward the lower observation ridge despite rain hitting so hard now it stung against my face like ice pellets. The air smelled overwhelmingly of wet earth and exposed stone while runoff streams carved fresh channels through the hillside around me. When I reached the overlook above Pine Ridge Summit, the entire subdivision below had already transformed into pure confusion. What should have been controlled stormwater movement through underground culverts had become total hydraulic overload. I could see multiple drainage channels ejecting water faster than designed capacity, forcing uncontrolled runoff across streets now disappearing beneath rapidly rising surface flow. Luxury vehicles sat stranded halfway down the central boulevard where water had begun moving too fast for safe passage. Porch lights flickered across dozens of homes while residents rushed outside staring at water spreading across driveways that had never experienced direct runoff exposure before. Then I spotted Rebecca. Even from this distance I recognized the white Lexus parked crooked outside the clubhouse where nearly a dozen residents had gathered under the covered entrance pointing frantically toward the lower lakefront district now absorbing the first major overflow surge. I watched several people surround Rebecca directly, their body language unmistakable even through heavy rain. Confusion first. Then anger. She was trying to explain something. I knew exactly what. She probably still believed county permits would somehow reverse physics. Another low structural groan rolled behind me from the damaged reservoir and I turned just long enough to see a second containment section begin shifting under mounting pressure. That meant remaining hydraulic resistance was collapsing faster than expected. Downhill flow rates were about to accelerate again. I looked back toward Pine Ridge Summit just as the lower retaining embankment surrounding the lakefront homes finally lost capacity and water surged over the concrete perimeter channels entirely, spilling uncontrolled through streets never engineered for direct runoff loads this severe. Movement exploded everywhere below. Vehicle headlights activating. Garage doors opening. Residents running between homes. Pure panic now. standing there soaked by freezing mountain rain while gravity finished carrying every consequence directly toward the community Rebecca Whitmore spent years pretending to control. I quietly stared downhill and realized something almost poetic about the entire disaster unfolding beneath me. She spent months trying to force obedience through power she never truly understood. In the end, all she had really done was dismantle the system quietly protecting everything she claimed to own. By 6:10 that evening, Pine Ridge Summit no longer resembled the pristine luxury mountain community Rebecca Whitmore had spent years obsessively controlling, and standing on the ridge above my property with freezing rain soaking through my jacket while thunder rolled violently across the darkening valley, I watched the exact chain reaction I had spent all morning warning people about finally consume everything arrogance had refused to understand. The lower residential district had become a maze of uncontrolled stormwater movement. Streets designed only for surface drainage overflow were now functioning like unintended river channels as runoff surged downhill far beyond safe engineered capacity. I could see expensive SUVs abandoned crooked near intersections where drivers had clearly attempted to move before realizing the streets were no longer passable. Decorative stone retaining walls surrounding several lakefront homes had already collapsed under sustained hydraulic pressure, sending mud and debris sliding directly across driveways and manicured landscaping that only hours earlier probably represented years of expensive suburban perfection. The rain itself had become relentless now, hammering every surface hard enough that visibility across the subdivision came in shifting waves of gray distortion between flashes of lightning overhead. I stepped back toward the porch and reached for my phone when it suddenly began vibrating in my hand before I could even unlock it. Unknown number. I already knew who it was before answering. The second I put the phone against my ear, I heard breathing first. Fast. Uneven. Then Rebecca's voice. Completely different than the woman who stood smiling beside excavators this morning. Daniel, what is happening? For almost 3 seconds I said nothing. Behind her I could hear pure chaos now. Car alarms. People shouting. Some kind of emergency vehicle siren somewhere farther down the valley trying to move through roads already overwhelmed by runoff. I closed my eyes briefly and listened because there was something strangely surreal hearing panic replace arrogance so completely. I explained exactly what was happening 9 hours ago, I said quietly. She inhaled sharply. The drainage system is backing up everywhere. Water is coming through lower access roads. The board says retaining walls are failing near the Lake District. I stared out across the valley watching headlights scatter chaotically through streets now carrying far more runoff than they were ever built to handle. Your neighborhood drainage system was engineered around my retention basin, I said calmly. You destroyed the hydraulic buffer stabilizing overflow pressure. Silence. Then her voice returned weaker now. Smaller somehow. Nobody told us that. I almost laughed hearing that because after everything she had done, that single sentence somehow perfectly summarized the entire disaster unfolding beneath us. Nobody told us. The excuse of every person who mistakes competence for competence. You were not supposed to touch infrastructure you did not understand, I said quietly. Another thunderclap rolled directly overhead while I watched county emergency vehicles finally begin entering the subdivision from the southern access road below. Too late. The system had already failed. Rebecca said nothing for several long seconds before speaking again, her voice barely above a whisper now. The homeowners are furious. I could hear people shouting near her again, louder this time. Angry voices. Demanding answers. Somewhere behind all that noise I heard another structural collapse echo faintly through the phone line before the connection suddenly cut off. I lowered the phone slowly and stared down at Pine Ridge Summit disappearing beneath heavy storm runoff and flashing emergency lights scattered across streets Rebecca once believed she controlled absolutely. After spending the entire day watching ignorance dismantle engineering one catastrophic decision at a time, I finally understood something my father used to repeat whenever contractors ignored safety calculations. Water never punishes people immediately. It waits patiently until people create their own consequences. And tonight, consequences had officially arrived. 3 weeks later the storm was long gone, but standing on the ridge above my property just after sunrise with cold mountain air moving through the pine trees around me, I could still see the scars left behind by a disaster that never needed to happen in the first place. The reservoir sat quiet again now, temporarily reduced to half capacity while reconstruction crews finished rebuilding the damaged western retaining section stronger than the original design I installed 15 years earlier. Fresh concrete forms lined the shoreline while county engineers moved carefully along the spillway inspection path reviewing reinforcement measurements under the pale morning light. The air smelled clean again, damp earth mixed with pine sap and the faint mineral scent rising off the water basin that had finally stabilized after days of emergency runoff management. But downhill the view looked very different. Pine Ridge summit still had not recovered. Nearly half the lower lakefront district remained under active repair permits after multiple retaining systems failed under pressure overload the night Rebecca Whitmore dismantled the structure, quietly protecting the entire community for over a decade. Several roads remained partially closed while excavation crews worked around damaged drainage infrastructure county inspectors now knew should never have failed under ordinary weather conditions. The investigation moved far faster than I expected once county engineers reviewed the original infrastructure records I submitted less than 24 hours after the storm ended. Temporary demolition authorization had been approved using falsified environmental compliance claims. Rebecca never requested hydraulic impact review before ordering excavation. The contractor company immediately shifted liability responsibility after learning they had been given incomplete documentation. Insurance providers refused multiple homeowner claims once investigators officially ruled the entire chain reaction resulted from unauthorized infrastructure interference rather than natural storm damage alone. But the part one found hardest to ignore was what happened to Rebecca herself. I heard from several residents she resigned from the HOA board less than 48 hours after county investigators completed their first report. Lawsuits followed almost immediately. Homeowners wanted answers. The same people she spent 7 years controlling through endless regulations and manufactured authority were suddenly demanding accountability from the woman who had gambled recklessly with their homes simply because she wanted to prove nobody was allowed to challenge her power. I stood quietly near the reservoir edge holding a cup of black coffee while early sunlight reflected softly across the rebuilt concrete foundation now curing beneath protective tarps. Somewhere below, workers continued repairing roads still damaged by runoff pressure that should never have reached the subdivision at all. I thought about the dozens of warnings I gave that morning. The phone calls nobody listened to. The engineering documents Rebecca refused to read. The countless opportunities she had to stop before crossing a line she never understood existed. My father used to tell me the most dangerous people in the world are not cruel people. They are competent people standing in places where knowledge should matter more than ego. Looking out over the valley now, I finally understood how right he had always been. Rebecca Whitmore believed authority meant forcing obedience from people she thought stood beneath her. She thought signatures, rules, and paperwork gave her control over reality itself. But sometimes justice does not come through courtrooms or revenge or anger. Sometimes justice arrives through the simple laws of nature, quietly reminding arrogant people that systems built on knowledge do not care who believes they are in charge. She thought she tore down a structure standing in her way. In the end, all she really destroyed was everything she was trying so desperately to control.